Hello, my name is Erica, and I'm here with class Catherine. We're talking about intergenerational trauma and epigenetics in the transmission of trauma. So, what is it? What is intergenerational trauma? Intergenerational trauma states that trauma can be transferred from the first generation of trauma survivors to second and third generation of offspring of survivors via complex post-traumatic stress disorder mechanisms. So what it's saying is that if, let's say, your parent has experienced some kind of complex, intense trauma, it can be passed down to your generation and generations after you and play a role in your mental health. And then what is epigenetics? So epigenetics is the study of chemical modification that do not change the genomic sequence itself, but instead affects phenotypic outcomes by altering the ways that genes are expressed. So what that's saying overall is that in your body you have DNA the same for every single cell. So some cells become cells in your heart, some cells become cells in your toenails, some cells become cells in your brain. Why does one cell know what it needs to have to turn to those kind of cells, those kind of job descriptions? And so DNA methylation happens. It turns on and off some different parts of your genome. So when you make new DNA, it creates different types of cells. And so what it's saying is that trauma can affect the epigenetic sequence and the DNA methylation, so the on and off switches of your cells and DNA, so you create different combos, and these combinations that you're creating that is unnatural does play a role in mental health. And so the next slide, we'll talk more about the problem and why it's such a big deal.
All right, so for epigenetics and intergenerational trauma, there's a couple problems that we investigated in regards to our research. And one of them is that in regards to intergenerational trauma, it is actually linked to child abuse and neglect. And in the research article, it says parents who have a history of maltreatment in their childhood pass down their maltreatment to their children, which causes impaired emotion regulation and increased irritability and impulsivity. So parents who has experience or has a background of maltreatment or trauma in their childhood also pass that down to their children, which creates this cycle of abuse and cycle of maltreatment. And that trauma that occurs during childhood is more likely to change the DNA compared to the trauma that occurs in their lifespan. And in regards to parents with mental illness, the research stated that parents with mental illnesses are more likely to suffer from psychopathology than children from healthy parents. So parents who has a mental illness will most likely pass down that mental illness down to their children as well. So in regards to that, clinicians needs to be aware of their clients' history to prevent and break the cycle of maltreatment in their families. And there's also another problem or our investigation that says that oxytocin receptor genetic and epigenetic variation is related to child abuse as well. And what Erica was speaking to about earlier was called the methylation, or the changing activity of DNA has a correlation with child abuse and trauma and adult psychiatric system. So that means that those who reported moderate or severe abuse also experienced greater levels of trauma over the lifespan and had higher levels of adult depression and anxiety. And in our next slide, we'll discuss why is epigenetics and intergenerational trauma important. It's important because the exposure to trauma that induce changes to the epigenome can increase the risk of developing poor health affecting psychological systems, including the stress, immune, and cardiovascular systems. So the exposure to this epigenome in regards to epigenetics, it can cause a change inside the body as well as outside the body. And it also is important because stress-induced epigenetic effects established in parental generations can affect the biology and health of health of descendant generations through intergenerational effects. And that causes stress-induced epigenetic effects, which can occur and thus be passed down during pregnancy. So not only can a parent pass down these effects down to their children when they're born, but they can also pass it down through a mother's pregnancy. And lastly, impacts can be seen at the individual, family, and community societal levels. And in our next slide, we'll be talking about the impacts of trauma.
Oh, the impact of trauma can be emotional. And when we react to trauma, this can be a normal reaction, but sometimes the impacts are mostly negative. And when we have been impacted by trauma, a lot of things do happen to us. We can get fatigued, anxiety comes up, a lot of things do come up, but we're going to talk about how trauma affects the individual and how it affects the person at the family level too. How does trauma impact an individual? He's talking about fear of the incident occurring again. He's talking about the shame that comes upon the individual that has gone through the trauma, or even their kids, because trauma can affect us at different levels. Because trauma is generational. Sometimes things that have happened to our grandparents, our great-grandparents, just like when it comes to the case of the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide or colonization of the indigenous people, we can see all this happening to them, the individuals that experience the trauma, and to their children, generations after. It talks about mistrust. This also happens to individuals that have gone through a lot of trauma. Guilt related to the personal happiness and parental experiences. Some people do feel guilt for things that happen to their parents. I'm talking about the Aboriginals in Canada that went to the residential schools. You do meet a lot of individuals crying about guilt of the things that happen to their parents. And there's a higher state and trait anger. Most of these individuals are really angry about what happened to their parents or their grandparents or great-grandparents. And until a counselor can sit down and help them deal with these issues, it's not something they can really do on their own. But if they work through it, it's something they can overcome. The impact of trauma can also be lower socioeconomic functioning. There can be increased suicidal thoughts and attempts because some of these people are depressed. And some of them feel, okay, why should I even be here when I'm in a waste of space? Or I'm going through a lot. These are the things I see with those going through suffering addiction because of all the trauma that their parents have gone through. When it comes to my interactions with the Aboriginals in Canada, we also notice that they have increased risk of PTSD because of all the trauma their grandparents went through. Even when you look at those that have been in the military and they have gone through a series of events that has affected them negatively, you can see them dealing with all this. And these are some of the things that the clinician should look out for when dealing with someone that has gone through trauma or trying to help someone that has PTSD. When it comes to the family level, a lot of things do happen as an effect of the impact of trauma. There is parent-child enmeshment. There is the overprotecting parents. Parents are trying to look out for their parents when there is no need for them to look out for them. They don't let them leave the house. They don't let them interact with certain group of people. That I've also seen personally, where an Aboriginal tells me, oh, my parents don't let me mix with so and so and so group of people because they took our land. And now the child social life has to suffer because of what the great-grandparents went through. There's parent-child role reversal. I've also seen kids that have gone through a lot of, their parents have gone through a lot of trauma and are dealing with addictions, be the parent in the home. They're the ones cooking, they're the ones cleaning at a very young age because the parents are not functional enough to help be the parents. And they can also have less accepting parents who don't encourage autonomy. You see a child that is not independent because the parents do not encourage it. Everything has to be done the way of the parents. There's also little intrafamilial conversation about traumatic events. People don't talk about trauma. And with the little research I've done this period, I say that if we can only talk about it, then people will know how to deal with it. And there's one statement I've heard about, especially in Canada, where people say, oh, he's dealing with addiction, he's an Aboriginal. I'm like, no, that's not right. But because people don't say these things out and they don't deal with it, it continues to happen in our society. Research shows that if they can talk about it and get help, it can actually be resolved. The impact of trauma can be resolved. There's also family violence due to this, the impact of the trauma, where parents are hitting their kids because that's all they know how to do. That's how their own parents dealt with them. And they don't know any other way out. Because there's also a lot of child abuse. Krista mentioned it earlier on when she talked in her slide, and the physical and emotional things that abuse that kids go through because of the impact of trauma on their family. We also talk about the lack of parental nurturing. Parents don't take care of their children. They don't know how to. Their own parents didn't take care of them. So how do you nurture a child or give love to a child when you don't even know how to love yourself? Because your own parents didn't even love you, or they didn't show you how. So these are some of the impacts of trauma that we have discussed. We do have a long list. And on the next slide, we are going to talk about the effects of trauma on the population.
So trauma also affects minority populations specifically. So trauma, it has adverse health for those in lower socioeconomic classes. So research has shown that Blacks and Hispanics have a higher risk of child maltreatment, chiefly witnessing domestic violence, and Asians, Black men, and Hispanic women had higher risks of war-related events than whites. So with how divided our class system is in the United States, people who live in a lower economic class have a higher risk of seeing more violence, experiencing more trauma, and that generally affects a higher portion of minorities than the majority culture around us in the United States. Also, trauma such as the Holocaust and the transatlantic slavery have had lasting effects on minorities. So the lifetime prevalence of PTSD was highest among Blacks at 8.7%, and an intermediate among Hispanics and whites at 7% and 7.4%, and lowest among Asians at 4.0%. So with PTSD, the African American population have a significantly higher percentage overall in the population at 8.7%. And so that shows that like trauma was such, especially with slavery and how prevalent in our US history it is, that still plays a huge role today, generations later. It's been 200 years, but you still see the effects of slavery that's being passed down generation from generation, especially with how things economically played out with the minority populations. Those people tend to live also in low socioeconomic classes. So they play a role with each other, they feed one another. And so you can see that this is not going away. It has a really huge effect on minorities in the United States. Now the next slide will talk more about how to address this problem.
Okay, so I'm going to start with addressing this problem from a biblical perspective and then sharing a clinical perspective of addressing the issue. Two verses we selected for this was Romans 12:2. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. The other verse we chose was Psalms chapter 107, verses 13 to 16. Sorry, folks. It says, Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness, the utter darkness, and broke away their chains. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind, for he breaks down gates of bronze and cuts through the bars of iron. We chose these two verses because although research shows that maltreatment can be passed down genetically, ultimately it's up to the person to choose if they'll continue with the cycle. The Bible tells us that we're destined to be set apart and that with God's help, we can be delivered from this distress. So it is possible to break the cycle. From a clinical perspective, research shows that the most effective way to reverse epigenetic changes is with behavioral treatments, although there are strides being made towards more biological methods. In addition to behavioral treatments, clinicians need to make a strong effort to be aware of their client's history to help prevent the cycle from perpetuating and break the cycle of maltreatment in those individuals. So in terms of prevention, that can apply to parents of young children, people who are pregnant, and even in learning how to parent, learning how to love your child, learning how to nurture your child, skills that, like Scholastica mentioned, some parents don't have because they didn't receive those growing up. But those are skills clinicians can work with their clients on to help them change the cycle. CBT, RABT, dialectical behavioral therapy, all these therapies can help with the way we think and help change the cycle so that we no longer have disruptive and negative thoughts and can change the way we view our lives and our situation on the whole. And on our next slide, I will conclude our presentation. So as we mentioned, epigenetic modifications can potentially be reversed by understanding the associations between trauma and the epigenomes to facilitate the development of interventions that could reverse trauma-induced impacts on the genome, thus reducing the burden of adverse outcomes with impacted persons. Adverse outcomes include things like diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, a lot of health and somatic concerns that you often hear with lower socioeconomic class persons. There has been successful research in rodents that identify specific genomes and neural circuits and brain activities that induce fear. And they have had some success in things that inhibit the activation of those fear genomes to help reduce the epigenetic effects. So further research should look at how we can translate the success in the study of rodents into humans successfully. Another thing to look at is that future research should look into accessing brain matter and looking at more in-depth complex DNA samples with epigenetic modifications. Currently, it's very difficult to get brain matter from living subjects. So future work should look at longitudinal studies in those impacted by trauma and those who haven't been, and then look at their post-mortem brain matter to see from a neural standpoint and a more complete picture of their DNA markers about how they were affected by epigenetics. And that concludes our presentation. And our last slide is our references. Thank you.